That hymn hauntingly resonates with my sermon this morning. Even more haunting because I had nothing to do with picking it. A gentleman named Hugh called. He's at the church and would like to see inside. Which church? Winnipeg or Gimli? Where is he now? I asked. Hugh's on 2nd, by the church in Gimli. He was at the library this afternoon and he's interested in seeing the church. The library's on 1st, I said. Yes, but Hugh's on 2nd. At least he was. He's not at the library anymore. I told him you'd be back in a couple of hours, so he's gone for tea, probably at that place on 3rd. I was still home in Winnipeg, catching up on a bit of work before heading out the door to return to our cottage north of Gimli. Cindy was enjoying some vacation time at the lake while I was forced to shuttle back and forth between the city and our cottage because despite my best intentions, work didn't let up for me this summer. That's what happens when you juggle positions in multiple organizations. It's difficult to get them all to leave you alone at the same time. The conversation that day didn't quite unfold in this manner, although it was eerily similar. I had no idea who Hugh was, nor why he was interested in our church at Gimli, but he told Cindy he would call back later. By the time I returned to Huldicott, the name of our country abode, Hugh had called twice more. And he and Cindy chatted at length. They evidently enjoyed pleasant conversations because before the end of the 3rd call, Cindy had suggested that perhaps he could stay with us over the weekend. When I learned of Cindy's invitation, I wasn't my best self in responding. "What were you thinking?" I barked. "We don't know this guy at all. What if he's a house burglar or a serial killer?" She stared at me as though I were the one who had lost his mind. "Well, you've invited people to stay with us before," she said. "Yes," I responded, "but at least I knew who they were before I extended the invitation." The argument was academic because we already had a full house. It was the weekend of the Icelandic festival. We always have a full house that weekend as family and friends need a place to stay when accommodations are nearly impossible to secure at Gimli. If you haven't booked a room or found a cottage to rent at least 10 months in advance, you'd better have a tent or a friend. But as the next week unfolded, I actually came to wish that we'd had spare room available to offer that weekend. When I made it back to Gimli, I called Hugh at his hotel, and within a few minutes understood why Cindy had felt so comfortable talking with him on the phone. It was like talking to an old friend. We made an appointment to meet at the church the next morning, and Cindy came along. For security reasons, we joked. If there was going to be a murder at the church, we were going to die together. I was touched. When we pulled up in front of the church, I noticed Hugh standing next to the sign, his knapsack beside him, older than I imagined and entirely unimposing. I turned to Cindy and said, "I've got this. I think I can take him if you'd prefer to go shopping." But she stayed with us, as curious about Hugh as I was. It turns out that he is something of a spiritual wanderer with a home base in the United Kingdom and another in Ottawa. He was born here in Winnipeg, where his father worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, but raised in England. It turned out his parents honeymooned in Iceland following the Second World War, long before that country became a tourist destination. He'd flown to Winnipeg from the Isle of Man, where he had spent the previous month doing research. And he spent some time in the city before making his way up to the Interlake, staying first in Teulon and then at Gimli. As we spoke, it became apparent that his travels are spiritual pilgrimages and that he immerses himself in the local culture of the places he visits. He knew more about Winnipeg, its history, culture, and places than many of those who live here. For 2 hours, we discussed the history of the Gimli Church, the roots of Unitarianism in Transylvania, the Icelandic immigrants to Canada, indigenous spirituality, and the Austrian-born philosopher Rudolf Steiner. Hugh is a disciple of Steiner, who was the founder of the anthroposophical movement, an outgrowth of the more widely known theosophy, and also the worldwide network of Waldorf schools, which today number around 1,000. Steiner inspired the creation of Friedrich Rittelmeyer's Christian community in Berlin, a movement on the boundary between liberal Christianity and the so-called German New Humanism, without dogma or a rigid polity, which emphasizes a Christianity of deeds. The Christian community claims 100,000 adherents worldwide, mostly in Germany, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. Needless to say, Hugh and I had a lot to talk about, so we headed off for lunch, an amused Cindy in tow. She's usually uninterested in theological and philosophical talk, but this time she was curious about the parallels and meeting points. And so she was curious to hear us talk further. She was probably also hungry, which helps to motivate someone to engage in a conversation they might not otherwise engage in. But it was a delightful lunch. It lasted perhaps 3 hours. If Hugh remained a danger, he was a charming one, and he was slowly charming his way from stranger to acquaintance to kindred spirit. Hugh Whistler had come to Gimli the week before the Icelandic festival, as I mentioned, planning to stay until the beginning of a conference being held near Fraserwood, That Good May Become, which was being held to mark the centennial of the Anthroposophical Society of Canada. Now, I pass through Fraserwood nearly every week, and it has its own unique charms. But I never imagined it as the venue for a national conference, a continental conference, in fact, with people coming from as far away as Europe and Asia to attend. So it took me a while to wrap my head around the logistics of this event. Rudolf Steiner was an advocate of what he called biodynamic agriculture. And it seems that there is an experimental farm near Fraserwood that operates on the organic principles of biodynamic agriculture. So tents were erected on the farm. Participants were fed at the spacious Fraserwood Hall, and those coming from afar were housed at the Gimli Training Center alongside refugees from Ukraine. Already regretting that I could not offer him a room, and knowing he was without a car, having been shuttled to Gimli by friends outside of Winnipeg, I offered to bring him back to the city the next morning and then convey him back to Gimli for his conference the following week, when there would be space available for him. I was commuting back and forth anyway. He suggested a hotel where he had stayed on earlier visits to Winnipeg, but I figured I should check it out first, just to make sure there would be room. Hugh doesn't do the internet, and references to him on the web are almost non-existent. Surely you realize that I had already checked him out online back when I viewed him as a potential threat. When I checked out the hotel he mentioned, it was permanently closed, a victim, a casualty of the pandemic. So I found him alternative accommodations and picked him up for the journey to Winnipeg. 6 days later, Cindy and I retrieved him from the hotel to deliver him to his conference. On the drive north, he gave us a detailed account of his time in Winnipeg. He'd visited nearby parks, bookstores, and cultural events, and we resumed our conversation about 12 interesting topics. He is a deeply spiritual man. He asked if we could stop at a store to pick up some bottled drinks for his stay at the Gimli Training Center. That's where Alva entered the picture. We stopped at the Fraserwood store, where Cindy took our picture beside the old gas pump, a couple of old relics with a third, and then we went inside to shop. Alva was leaving the store as we arrived and offered to take a picture of the three of us together, which Cindy declined, even though our family has been jokingly referring to Cindy's friend Hugh for the past 3 months. However, Cindy and Alva struck up a conversation, and when Hugh and I returned, we were invited to visit an old settler's home that stands on her property. We followed Alva home after walking through the yard with its exquisite garden. We arrived at an old log house, no bigger than my study, which has braved the elements for well over a century. Looking at the building, I imagined the home of my own great-great-grandparents, the one they had occupied when they arrived in the Interlake, for it was about the same size and similar construction. There was a small loft, accessible only from the outside, where the boys of the family that lived there had slept. There was a cutout in the door so that they could reach out and unlatch the lock that would be closed when they slept there. While I tend to stare off in the distance, Cindy's eyes always seem to focus on the details of things. She notices what isn't noticeable. So she set about to take close-up pictures of the building while Alva told us all about it, told us about the family that once lived there. I assumed that she was a descendant of the people who once lived in this humble home, but I was mistaken. On our walk back, I overheard Hugh and Alva exchanging a few words in Welsh. I didn't know that in the moment, but it soon became apparent. Welsh. Then Hugh recited a limerick he recalled about a town in Wales, which turned out to be Alva's birthplace. I was dumbstruck. How had the two of them stumbled into this improbable connection? For the rest of our time together, Alva told us the story of how she and her husband came to be in Canada. Along the way, she mentioned that both of her names were unusual, at least in this part of the world. Alva Odlum. My ears perked up. The name sounded familiar to me, but I couldn't put my finger on why that was so. However, Alva was every bit as charming as Hugh, so I decided to immerse myself in the moment. But the question lingered. On leaving, Alva presented Cindy with a jar of raspberries from her garden, which sweetened the rest of the time at the cottage that week. We dropped off Hugh at his new accommodations and settled back in at Hildecott, where I intended to get back to work while Cindy resumed vacation. But curiosity is a powerful motivator, a very powerful motivator, not to mention a vague but nagging feeling of familiarity, and I was curious to know more about Alva. Why had no one in the area told me about her before? I thought and thought and thought, and then I remembered that I had seen her name twice. Once when CTV profiled her because she offered to come out of retirement to administer vaccines during the COVID pandemic. You see, she's a retired dentist. And again, while preparing a story for my newspaper about the recipients of the Nellie McClung Women Trailblazer Awards, which were presented to 150 recipients to mark Manitoba's sesquicentennial. It should have surprised no one that Alva would volunteer for service, even though she was considered to be in an at-risk group herself, since she was one of the first, if not the very first, Manitoba dentists to treat AIDS patients back when those with AIDS were being shunned, not only by the general public, but also by medical professionals. Dentistry was the career that she had come to Canada to pursue, and she was the first woman to practice dentistry in this province, although another woman had earlier graduated from dentistry here. She subsequently joined the Faculty of Dentistry at the University of Manitoba, and she is especially celebrated for her work with marginalized groups, including disabled patients, Indigenous people, and cancer patients. She served where others declined to go. Since these unexpected encounters this past summer, I've enjoyed a long and wonderful conversation with Alva, and I've received a cryptic card from Hugh as he passed through Thunder Bay, accompanied by an essay on the sayings of Jesus by a member of the Christian community in London, and a bag of Irish breakfast tea to wash it down with. Neither Hugh nor Alva is ever likely to know the restorative influence that they had on my spirit this summer. But it has been both humbling and inspiring to me to grasp how even a passing influence can be transformative in the lives of others. It takes less to spark joy than we sometimes realize. And we are all waiting at times for the person we need to enter our lives at the moment we need them. Lightning struck twice for me in August. As I say, Hugh and Alva crossed my path right when I needed them most. Between the recent deaths of people I cared about deeply, the demands of juggling a heavier than usual workload, and a complicated situation unfolding for a board I serve on, I was in a pretty sour mood this summer. I was like the proverbial apple picked before it was ripe. These chance encounters with two strangers conspired to buoy my sagging spirits and change my outlook for the better. From my perspective, our encounters were serendipitous, but those with a more deterministic worldview might have called it grace. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, says the book of Hebrews, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. In common parlance, people imagine angels to be disembodied spiritual beings, rather like ghosts, but with sweeter dispositions. Most are seen as benevolent, serving as protectors of individuals, families, or even entire nations. Others, such as fallen angels or the dreaded angel of death, have more sinister reputations. But from the Bible to Charles Dickens, angels have been a valuable literary device. As a metaphor, angels may refer to elements of the human character, such as when Abraham Lincoln referred in his first inaugural address to the better angels of our nature, in his appeal to the bonds of affection and the mystic chords of harmony that bound people together. We described well-behaved children as angels, and fundraisers love angel donors when they're raising money for a noteworthy cause. For the most part, whether in religion or literature, angels are harbingers of goodness, and they come to us in the flesh, not as spiritual beings. They come to us through everyday people. They may be imperfect, but they live beyond their imperfections through authenticity and integrity. Hugh and Ulva crossed my path as messengers this summer. Angels, if you will, reminding me that life's challenges can be met and overcome, that life's shadows do not last forever, and that our better angels call us to serve others whenever we can, wherever we can, however we can. G.K. Chesterton quipped, "Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly." But I would add that in approaching life deeply, the angelic persons we encounter, often without our even recognizing their essential nature in the moment, invite us all to live more deeply, to savor our moments, and to seek joy where we may least expect it, but especially in the company of strangers. Please join in hymn number 1064 in the Teal hymnal, My Blue Boat Home.